Mr Speaker.
Brendan Burns.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Here we are at the final stages of this important piece of legislation, the Dairy Industry Restructuring New Sunset Provision Amendment Bill. And I wanted to just say at the outset that and acknowledge the contribution that the dairy industry makes to this country. It is a $10 billion export earner, and that underscores the importance that the Labor Party attaches to this bill and some semblance, I suppose, of regulation around the pricing of milk in this country. But having said that, I do want to express the concern that I'm a great supporter of keeping dairying in New Zealand hands, and that, of course, has been the model until the DAERA bill came in. I think Fonterra controlled around 96% of the milk produced. That has stretched somewhat over the course of the last 10 years, and this bill is attempting to provide some final mechanisms to ensure competition in milk supply. But in that 10-year period, we've seen some other changes that I think we as a House do need to note. And I wanted to particularly point to the increasing presence of foreign investment in the dairy industry. And I'm no xenophobe. Foreign investment has helped build this country. But there comes a point where you have to question the value that foreign investment brings, not just in terms of the implications it raises for us as a nation short of capital, constantly needing to import capital, and therefore effectively providing a mechanism which keeps our dollar high and makes export industries like Fonterra that more troubled as they try to compete in foreign markets. But also the questions it brings around environmental matters. And while we are assured that everybody is covered by the same laws, I guess we have a feeling, we have an innate belief that New Zealand-controlled companies with a stake in this country, with a commitment to the communities of this country, will be better environmental stewards than those who are simply there for the returns that it can bring. And I have, in the passage of this bill, noted the increasing stake that foreign investors have in dairy industry. I look at the Synlait plant near Dunsandel, the plant itself now 50% owned by a Chinese investment company. And I don't think it matters whether the shareholding is held in Sydney or Shanghai. The net economic effect is the same, and I think the distance from the communities that underscore New Zealand, which I think are reflected in this bill, in that we still have 80% plus of the milk market controlled by Fonterra. Fonterra is, of course, 100% pure Kiwi in terms of its ownership structure, and I think that is relevant, and that's why this bill is in front of us. We're wanting to see healthy competition. We are wanting to see Fonterra still able to trade profitably, and I note one of the submissions to the Select Committee, and I was on the Primary Production Select Committee for a part at least of submission on this bill, Fonterra putting up an NZIER report which suggested that the cost to it of the regulations that are in place requiring it to supply its competitors costs of the order of $500 million a year, which $700 million. I'm happy to elevate the figure from my dairy industry learned colleague across the way, Shane Ardern. So $700 million. That's a big price to pay. And if that wasn't engendering competition between New Zealand companies and driving competitive milk prices and the like, I don't think we'd have too much of a view about it. But of course, we've seen nothing but milk prices rise over the last few years, and we've also seen that increasing foreign component in investment. And we've got to look at the bigger nations that are food short, and strategic investments are being made. We've seen the kind of pin-up case of the Crayfer farms. Will it be sold? Will they be sold to foreign investors? Will they not? We're expecting outcomes on that fairly shortly. But that is not the end of it. That is not the end of it. We've got the Chinese investment in Synlait. We've got Singaporean investment in open country. We've had, if we still do not have, I think a 100% stake in the New Zealand Dairies plant down near Waimate. And as I say, it's nothing about the ethnicity of the investment. It doesn't matter if it's Sydney or it's Shanghai. It does create two issues, one around the outflow of capital, which keeps our dollar high and our interest rates high and makes it that much harder for companies like Fonterra to remain competitive in very strong and competitive international markets. And there is the question about whether something which is purely there for the dollar return without the commitment to the communities of New Zealand, as envisaged, I think, under this bill, will be able to deliver the same sort of environmental outcomes, especially, I would have to say, in the light of what I think is still very weak environmental law, as evidenced by the Environmental Protection Authority Bill, which passed through the House only today, and in respect of the clean water, fresh water management national policy statement released earlier this week by the Minister for the Environment, which simply fails to enforce any new regulatory controls on delivering safe, clean, fresh water. There is another concern that I'd like to refer to, and I noted the Minister of Agriculture took a question in the House today in respect of irrigation and water storage. And of course, Fonterra and other dairy producers, I think, will be the major beneficiaries of the government's near $500 billion commitment to increasing irrigation and water storage. The dairy industry most likely to be the major beneficiary of that, and I think the Minister indicated that in talking about the sorts of export returns that we could see boosted by that investment, $1.4 billion over the next 7 years. And of course he went on to say that what it was about was taking a balanced view to deliver economic growth and environmental sustainability. And I, as I said at the start, believe the dairy industry, as evidenced by this bill, can actually, if it's done right, can contribute both economically and on an environmentally sustainable basis if it's done properly. But I have to note the issues that were raised last year about Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora, which, according to an Environment Court report back in 2005, so 6 years ago, was found to have been biologically killed by the flow of nutrients and other pollutants into those waterways. It was regarded as one of the world's top trout fisheries only 30 or 40 years ago. And we have to say that the growth that's envisaged in the dairy industry under this bill, going through its final stages in Parliament tonight, is it going to mean we're going to see more Lake Ellesmeres? Because we aren't seeing paralleled to this bill strong environmental protection. And I do also have to note, Mr. Speaker, that there was a decision by DOC last year to refuse a grazing licence to a farmer, a dairy farmer, not sure if he was supplying Fonterra or Synlait, be one of the two, on the banks of Lake Ellesmere, and that decision was overturned after an intervention first by the Selwyn MP to the Minister of Agriculture, and that, I think, underscores the concerns that I have and Labor holds in respect of this continued repetition when we're debating bills like this, which will see further growth in the dairy industry, when we see continued repetition of the line that there will be balance between economic and environmental outcomes under this government opposite. And one has to say, when we see a lake which has died because of nutrients flowing into it, DOC takes an entirely appropriate decision to say no to a farmer having a lease of land right on the edge of that lake which has died because of nutrification, and a minister gets involved and assists a farmer to overturn a DOC decision. That, I think, underscores the very strong doubts that I and others on this side of the House hold in respect of the supposed balance. We are constantly told from the Prime Minister down about getting the balance right between economic and environmental policy, and the old dairy snorter across the way there might interject, but the reality is that is the definition of balance. There's an example where balance is only at the environment's expense, and that's why, even though we support this bill in respect of the continuance of some competitive model and basis in the dairy industry, We do so with some concerns, some very real concerns, as evidenced as recently as the question and answer of the House today from the Minister. Balance for this government tends to mean at the environment's expense.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.